Have you ever built something so magnificent only to walk through its doors one day and feel like a stranger? That was exactly how Charles Edmonds felt as he stood quietly in the lobby of the Aldridge Grand, one of the crown jewels of his luxury hotel empire. At 52, Charles wasn't just successful. He was legendary in the hospitality industry. But that afternoon, dressed in jeans and a windbreaker instead of his usual tailored suit, no one recognized him. And that was exactly the point. Charles hadn't come to be seen, had come to see. Over the past 3 months, complaints had trickled in, then swelled into a steady stream. Reports of guests being ignored, treated rudely, or mysteriously denied reservations had all led back to this specific property. He could have handled it from his corner office downtown, sent auditors, shuffled managers, or issued stern memos. But Charles knew better. Problems like these weren't fixed on paper. They had to be witnessed in the flesh. So there he was, no limo, no assistance, no special treatment. Just a tired traveler walking up to a front desk to check in. What he didn't expect was to feel invisible, as if the place he had built from the ground up no longer recognized him, and worse, no longer reflected the values he stood for. The woman at the counter didn't look up. No greeting. No eye contact. And in that moment, Charles realized this wasn't just a customer service issue. This was personal, and he was about to make it unforgettable. It didn't take long for Charles Edmonds to confirm what he had suspected all along. Standing at the front desk, he watched as the young woman, her name tag read Tiffany, continued scrolling through her phone, fully aware of his presence, but making no effort to engage. Charles gave a light cough. Nothing. He tapped the counter. Still no response. Finally, he leaned forward and said politely, "Excuse me." With an exasperated sigh, Tiffany looked up as if being interrupted from something far more important than her job. "Yeah," she said flatly, her tone laced with boredom and irritation. Not a welcome, not a "how may I help you?" Just that single word flung like an afterthought. Charles, maintaining his composure, responded evenly, "I have a reservation. The name's Charles Edmonds." That was when it happened, the moment she glanced at him, paused, and made her silent judgment. Tiffany turned back to her monitor, typing as though the keyboard had offended her. "Nope, nothing under that name," she announced without even glancing back. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Could you check again, please?" Her response was a half-hearted eye roll, followed by a few more lazy keystrokes. Still nothing. "Maybe you booked the wrong location," she said with a mocking smirk, already reaching for her phone again. Charles remained calm, though inside he was seething. He pulled out his phone and held up the confirmation email, clearly showing the reservation at this hotel for this night. Tiffany barely glanced at the screen. "Well, the system doesn't lie," she said with a shrug, her tone now bordering on dismissive sarcasm. It was the kind of encounter Charles had read about in guest complaints. Cold indifference masked as policy, the weaponization of incompetence. Only now it was happening to him. And then the critical moment arrived. Charles accessed the hotel's internal reservation portal from his personal device, something only high-level executives could do. Within seconds, he found his booking was there, or at least it had been. The system showed it had been manually deleted just 30 minutes earlier. The name next to the deletion, Tiffany S. Front Desk. He stared at the screen, his jaw tight. It wasn't a system glitch. It was a choice. She had looked at him, decided he didn't belong, and quietly erased his presence. That wasn't just bad service, it was prejudice. It was a quiet act of erasure. And now that he had the proof, Charles knew exactly what to do next. This wasn't going to be a simple correction. It was going to be a reckoning. Charles took a slow breath, steadying himself, then looked back up at Tiffany with a smile so calm, it should have been a warning. "Tell me something," he said, his voice smooth, but carrying weight. "What happens when a front desk agent deletes a reservation?" Tiffany didn't look up from her phone. "It just removes it from the system," she muttered dismissively. "No big deal." Charles nodded. "And who has the ability to do that?" This time she blinked and glanced up briefly. "Only front desk staff." "Like me," she replied, her voice laced with annoyance. "Why?" Without a word, Charles turned his phone around and showed her the screen. For the first time that evening, the smug veil dropped from her face. Her eyes widened as she saw her name, Tiffany Sanders, next to the cancellation log. Color drained from her cheeks. Her fingers twitched slightly as if scrambling for a way to undo the digital damage, but there was no backspace button for this mistake. I didn't mean to," she stammered, but Charles cut her off. "Don't," he said firm and low. "Don't try to lie your way out of this." The look on her face shifted from dismissive to desperate in a heartbeat. She knew. She had misjudged him, seen only an older black man in casual clothes, and decided he didn't belong in a place like the Aldridge Grand. Now her name was logged forever beside an act of silent discrimination. "Here's what's going to happen," Charles said, leaning forward slightly. "You're going to find me a room, right now." Tiffany fumbled at her keyboard, hands trembling. "Oh, of course, sir. I found a room 1427. Charles didn't reach for the keycard. Instead, he narrowed his eyes. 1427. That's the one next to the maintenance closet, across from the elevators, faces the dumpsters. Tiffany froze. He wasn't just any guest. He knew this hotel, every floor, every room. She had tried to insult him a second time and failed. "Do I look stupid to you?" Charles asked, his voice now like steel wrapped in velvet. No, sir. I just..." "Then why," he interrupted, "are you treating me like I don't belong in a hotel I built?" Silence fell over the lobby. Even the bellhop nearby stopped mid-step. The couple on the lounge couch pretended to read their newspapers, but their eyes were locked on the unfolding scene. Tiffany couldn't speak. She only nodded, sliding a different room key across the counter with shaking fingers. Charles picked it up slowly. "Thank you," he said, but his tone made it clear this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Charles didn't head straight to the room. Not yet. The keycard for the deluxe suite now tucked in his jacket pocket, he instead made his way through the quiet corridor toward the private executive elevator, the one staff rarely used unless summoned by upper management. Once inside, he tapped his access badge against the hidden panel. The elevator hummed to life and ascended silently to the top floor, bypassing every guest level. As the doors opened to the private executive suite, Charles stepped into a space flooded with soft lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows. This wasn't for rest, it was a war room. He set his laptop down, logged into the company's internal system, and got to work. Guest complaint logs, staff, conduct records, incident reports, all flowing into one dashboard. And just like he expected, Tiffany's name wasn't a one-time problem. She was all over the place. There were over a dozen unresolved complaints tied to her login credentials, check-ins, mysteriously canceled guests reporting cold treatment accusations of discrimination brushed off as policy enforcement. Shed refused upgrades to minority guests, while offering them to others ignored calls for assistance and dismissed refund requests without documentation. Charles' fingers moved steadily, his expression unreadable. It wasn't just Tiffany. It was a culture disease of complacency and quiet bigotry that had been allowed to take root under the watch of someone who should have known better. He clicked over to the managerial review logs. That's where he found the next piece of the puzzle. Stephen Daly, the hotel's general manager, had flagged none of the issues. Not one. In fact, he'd marked Tiffany's performance as satisfactory on every review. Charles leaned back in his chair and let out a long, tired breath. Stephen. A man who had spent years riding the wave of middle management, saying the right things in corporate meetings, smiling in quarterly video calls, but clearly doing the bare minimum to keep the peace while ignoring rot beneath the surface. The problem wasn't just one negligent employee, it was weak leadership, a lack of backbone. And Charles had seen it before. The kind of manager who avoided confrontation because it made things messy. Well, now things were about to get messy. He stood up calm and resolute, then made his way back down. No entourage, no public statement, just a man with a mission. Charles walked through the lobby past Tiffany without even acknowledging her and headed straight into the manager's office without knocking. Stephen looked up from his desk, startled. Mr. Edmonds. What a surprise. Charles closed the door behind him, locked it, and leaned against it. No, Stephen, he said quietly, the surprise is coming for you. Stephen Daly's face paled as soon as Charles uttered those words. The casual warmth he had feigned vanished, replaced by a thin layer of sweat forming just above his brow. Two was going to handle it, he stammered, reaching for a file he clearly didn't need. Charles didn't move from the door. You were going to handle it, he repeated each syllable, landing with deliberate weight. You've had complaints about her for months, maybe longer, and you did nothing. Stephen opened and closed his mouth like a man searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. She just needed more training, he offered weakly. Charles laughed, not the kind that shared a joke, but the kind that signaled a man done with excuses. Stephen, this woman isn't a trainee struggling with the system. She's a walking lawsuit waiting to happen, and you let her operate unchecked in my hotel. The room fell into tense silence. Charles walked forward, slow and steady, then placed a printed copy of the reservation deletion log onto Stephen's desk. That's me, he said, pointing to his name. And that he tapped the line marked deleted by Tiffany Sanders is your employee deliberately removing a paying guest from the system. Me, the founder of this hotel. Stephen's mouth dropped. Two didn't know it was you? That's exactly the problem, Charles snapped. You don't know what's going on in your own lobby. You've let this hotel become a customer service nightmare under your nose. Stephen slumped in his chair, visibly deflated. He looked like a man who had just realized the gallows had been built right outside his office door. Charles crossed his arms. You want to keep your job, Stephen? The manager nodded desperately. Then you're going to walk out there and fire Tiffany right now in front of every guest, every staff member, and every whispering voice in that lobby. Stephen's face drained of color. You can't be serious. Do I look like I'm joking? Charles asked coldly. 2 minutes later, the lobby that had earlier ignored Charles fell into stunned silence as Stephen approached the front desk. Tiffany, oblivious, glanced up from her phone. What now? She muttered. But her smirk faded the instant she saw the look on his face. Tiffany Sanders. Stephen said, his voice louder than usual. You're terminated, effective immediately. Gasps rippled across the lobby. Tiffany tried to protest, to plead, but it was too late. Her time was up. And Charles, he watched from a distance with a calm, satisfied smile. Justice had just clocked in. As Tiffany stormed out of the hotel, her heels clacking furiously against the polished marble floor, the weight of her disgrace seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud refusing to drift. She cast one final venomous glance over her shoulder, but Charles didn't even blink. He stood near the grand staircase, hands folded behind his back, watching the door close behind her. Justice had been swift, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The problem went deeper than one rogue employee. He wasn't just here for revenge, he was here for restoration. His empire had cracks, and today he was going to start sealing every one of them. Stephen, still pale and visibly shaken, approached Charles with the look of a man who had just survived a car crash. "I handled it," he whispered weakly. Charles turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "No, Stephen," he replied, voice low but commanding. "I handled it. You just stood there and tried not to pass out." Stephen gave a nervous chuckle, the kind people use when they hope someone else is joking. Charles wasn't. "You know, I could fire you too," he continued, watching Stephen flinch, "for letting this place rot under your nose." The manager opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "I'll fix it." I swear he finally managed. Charles raised an eyebrow. "That's cute," he muttered. "But no, you won't be fixing anything." He turned away, leaving Stephen standing there speechless and sweating. Charles made his way back to the front desk, where the remaining clerks stood stiff as statues. He leaned over the counter and scanned their faces, young, nervous, and now suddenly very aware of who they were dealing with. "Listen up," he said. "Things are about to change around here. Fast." One clerk, barely older than 20, nodded so hard it was almost comical. "Yes, sir. Do you work for corporate?" Charles smiled, slow and deliberate. "Something like that." He picked up the hotel phone, punched in a direct line, and waited. The line clicked. "This is Edmonds," he said flatly. "Shut the hotel down for a full-scale audit, effective immediately. I want every guest compensated, every complaint reviewed, and every employee reevaluated. If they can't cut it, they're gone." Gasps and stunned silence followed. One staff member's eyes widened like dinner plates. Another woman let out a small gasp. Stephen, overhearing from behind, looked like he might faint. Charles pocketed the phone and looked up one last time. "Yeah," he said with a small smirk. "I'm that Edmonds." And with that, he turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving a lobby frozen in realization. The king had returned to his castle, and now he was cleaning house. By the time Charles reached his Suite 1 of the penthouse-level executive rooms, he had personally designed. The hotel was already buzzing like a kicked beehive. Word had spread like wildfire. The man who had just issued the shutdown order wasn't some VIP with a temper or an undercover inspector. He was Charles Edmonds, the founder, the architect, the very man whose name was engraved into the lobby plaque. In every hallway, behind every housekeeping cart and service door, staff whispered and scrambled. The man behind the empire had shown up unannounced, and heads were already rolling. Inside the suite, Charles wasted no time. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down at the sleek glass desk, and opened his laptop. This wasn't about power plays anymore. This was damage control, surgical and immediate. He began cross-checking every guest complaint flagged over the past 6 months, late check-ins blamed on technical issues, guests mysteriously downgraded from suites, and a disturbing trend of overlooked concerns coming from people of color, single women, and elderly travelers. There was a pattern, and Tiffany was just the most visible symptom. He moved next to the employee performance evaluations. Red flags lit up like runway lights, Tiffany's name repeated in conflict reports, internal warnings buried under vague manager notes, and worst of all, instances where she had bypassed system protocols to quietly remove reservations without triggering alerts. She was good at hiding the damage, but not good enough. And the question that haunted Charles now wasn't just how this had gone unnoticed. It was why it had been tolerated. Then he saw it. Stephen Daly's entire managerial history at this location read like a lesson in mediocrity. No disciplinary actions taken. No staff terminations in over a year. No conflict resolution trainings requested. He was a human shield-a-man who maintained peace by looking the other way. The kind of leader who thought silence was safer than accountability. Charles clenched his jaw. That kind of thinking was poison, and it had crept into the very heart of his brand. Just then, a knock at the door. Charles opened it to find Stephen White as a sheet holding a manila folder. "Mr. Edmonds, please." "Two had no idea it was you," he began, voice shaking. If I had known, Charles cut him off with a stare sharp enough to slice through walls. "That's the problem, Stephen. You had no idea what was happening in your own hotel." He stepped into the hallway, crossing his arms. "Tell me, did you fire Tiffany?" "Yes," Stephen stammered, "just like you asked." Charles nodded. "Good. Now pack your things." Stephen blinked, stunned. "What, you're done?" And with that, Charles shut the door in his face. No second chances. Not in his house. Charles stood in the quiet of his suite, the echo of the closing door still hanging in the air like punctuation on a chapter long overdue. He poured himself a drink not to celebrate, but to reflect. This hotel, his hotel, would never be the same again. That night, while others scrambled to catch their breath, Charles began the real work. He blacklisted Tiffany from ever working in his properties again. Stephen's access to all company systems was revoked. And then he turned to the guest seach complaint, personally reviewed every wronged customer, refunded and upgraded to VIP status for their next stay. Because that's what leadership means, not just building an empire, but defending the people it's meant to serve. As dawn crept over the city skyline, Charles sat back in his chair and exhaled. The damage had been contained, the rot cut out, but the lesson remained. Sometimes true leadership isn't about making noise, it's about taking quiet, decisive action when no one's watching. The real test of power isn't how high you rise, but how deep you're willing to go to fix what's broken. If this story moved you or reminded you of the importance of standing up when something isn't right, we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a moment where quiet justice changed everything? Drop your story in the comments. We read every one. And if you believe in fairness, dignity, and the kind of leadership that holds the line when no one else will, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded respect isn't given by title. It's earned in moments like these.